Welcome to the last session. This is session 6, and the materials are in the usual place, and they look something like this. Now, this session is a little bit different from other sessions in the sense that it's mainly a role play. This role play is called Bafa Bafa, and this document called Bafa Bafa Trainer Notes tells you exactly how to carry it out. I'm just going to let you read that by yourself. They're very detailed, and it will take you through the procedure of what to do with the students. It's a very interesting role play to simulate culture shock. So at the end of the role play, you can ask the students these questions. If they have learned anything from the programme that could help them manage potentially confusing and frustrating intercultural encounters. A good answer would reference the key skill of intercultural competence, which we saw in session 1 on one of the slides, separating observation from interpretation. It's at this point that you can go to the Google Slides presentation. And here is the slide with the final question to the students. That the role play was designed to simulate culture shock. So you ask this question to them, you maybe give some prompts, and you try to elicit the fact that it's this central skill of separating observation from interpretation and all that entails. So this is actually a straight lift from the slideshow for the first session, just to remind them about this central skill, and particularly these sub-skills. Knowing the composition of their own cultural filter, recognizing and controlling emotional responses. The role play will elicit quite strong emotional responses because the filter is challenged, etc. So this is what we're coming full circle here, and we're trying to remind our students of this. Again, this is a lift from the first session, ethnocentrism and ethno-relativism, the stages that we ideally want to go through on an intercultural competency program and on life in general in order to become more ethno-relative. And it's worthwhile reminding them of all the things that we've been doing on this program in terms of specific knowledge of specific cultures, theoretical knowledge, how to classify cultures, skills such as listening, observing, interpreting, thinking critically, etc. So this is just a wrap up from the role play and to come full circle. Moving on, just a slide here about putting it into practice. I think this actually says it quite succinctly. Father playing with his son. Son says, "Dad." Father says, "Yes, this is great." Father agrees. And later in the house, "You had a meaningful conversation with Jeremy. How?" First, you have to get over the idea of using words. Okay, so this is an example of reading what's under his son's iceberg. It involves suspending his own values and expectations. It involves having the right attitude that you want the relationship to be successful. It involves developing skills, in this case playing baseball and saying a lot with just a few words, and the result is success. Okay, this is the final slide now. So at this point, we just want to put the visitors of the role play out of misery, and we want to tell them what rules the Bafa Bafans have been following. So this we would like to elicit this from them, but this is just final confirmation that this is why they have felt so confused during the role play. Okay, so all that should take you, I would say, the best part of an hour. And then the last half hour of the session is taken up with something. It's a development from the role play, and it's called the DIO model. Okay, and we introduced this with this photograph. We asked the students to describe this photograph. There are actually very detailed teacher notes for this activity too. I won't describe this in detail. Again, you just simply read this, read these instructions, and you'll be very clear how to deliver this session. Just give you the basics here. You ask the group to describe this photo, and you'll have sentences like the girl is trying to attack the boy, the boy shouldn't let her take advantage of him, he's trying to defend himself, he looks scared, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So you get the students to write down about 5 sentences that describe this photograph, and then front and center in the group you collect some examples of their sentences. Okay, in your hand you have 4 board pens of different colors. Okay, and the idea is that you have 4 different kinds of response that students normally give to this photograph. Very seldom do they actually describe what's going on. So a description is the boy is raising his arms, his left arm slightly more than his right arm. He's looking at the girl. Okay, the girl's left hand is outstretched. That is pure objective description. So if you get sentences like that, write them on the board in one color. If you get sentences, another response, by far the most common, is to interpret. Okay, so what you interpret here is your sentences that talk about the intentions of the agents. Okay, so the girl is trying to attack the boy is defending himself. These are all interpretations. Okay, if you get these responses, write it on the board using another color. Another common response is an evaluation. Okay, now I've already given you some indications of this. This is how the agents are feeling, or some kind of judgment about what's happening here. Okay, so the boy looks scared. He shouldn't be attacking him, something like this. Okay, that's an evaluation. It's a judgment. It's talking about the emotions of the characters. Okay, and finally you have an outcome. So this is less common, but it follows from an evaluation or a judgment, which is what should now be done. What should now be done based upon your evaluation of the situation. Okay, so you would say, if I was her parents, I would punish her, I would teach her right from wrong, I would tell that boy to toughen up, etc. Okay, so that last kind of sentence you write on the board with another colour. Now at this point they've got lots of sentences, maybe at least 2 of each on the board, and you ask the students to discern a pattern here. Why have you written these sentences in different colours? Okay, up until this point you haven't mentioned the word description, interpretation, evaluation or outcome. All you've done is take their sentences and colour code them. Okay, so now they have to work out what the classifications are, right? They get so far in this, and you have to give them a little bit of a hand, but finally you describe what DIEO. Okay, so DIEO stands for description, interpretation, evaluation, outcome. So it's a framework commonly used in intercultural training to encourage students to suspend judgment and avoid the default tendency to interpret cultural behaviour from the perspective of their own cultural filter. So what happens is, when we're faced with a scene from a culture we don't quite understand, we don't know the rules, for example, we tend to jump in very quickly to interpretations and evaluations and therefore outcomes. Okay, so this model tells us to describe objectively what's happening from the beginning. Okay, And when we have focused on purely the objective content of the experience, we can venture to suggest interpretations, okay? Some of which will be culturally dependent on our own filter, and some of which, if we are open-minded, if we're tolerant, if we've accrued a critical mass of experiences of different cultures, there will be competing interpretations, okay? From competing interpretations come competing evaluations, multiple evaluations relative to each other, and multiple outcomes, okay? So we were practicing the DIEO on photos, okay? However, when you immerse yourself in another culture, it can be useful to keep a journal of your impressions and experiences based on the DIEO format, okay? Now, this is something which would be good if you've got any international overseas students in your class, okay? But also in an age of global travel, you might have students who are traveling on exchanges, going on summer schools, for example. So this is something. The DIEO journal is a tool, a reflective tool that allows them to increase their intercultural competence, okay? So you give them an example journal format, okay? This can be printed out and given to the students. And it's basically a rubric that they can use to write up their impressions, okay? For example, so for interpretations, how did you initially interpret the behavior? So the student is in their accommodation in, let's say, Jakarta at the end of the night, reflecting on some encounter that he or she had during that day. How did they interpret the behavior initially? What alternative interpretations might be responsible for the behavior? What values, beliefs, and meanings under the participants' own cultural iceberg could also give rise to this behavior? How did they feel at the time? How do alternative interpretations change your emotional reaction to that behavior? Okay. And outcomes. What have you learned from this encounter? Have you noticed a gap in your skills or knowledge? Have you formulated a hypothesis which you can now test? Okay. So this is how experientially the DIEO model can work in the field as the students are having genuine intercultural encounters. Okay. How we finish this session is we simply give them 2 more photographs. Okay. And we get them to practice DIEO with these 2 photographs. And they can do this individually. They can write down their impressions. They can explore different interpretations, different evaluations of what's going on, and they can compare these together. Okay. Finally, you have the summary of this session. Okay. So they should now have a better understanding of what culture shock feels like through the role play. The DIE model is theoretical knowledge. It's also skill, right? Because it goes to the second skill point here, suspending judgments and inappropriate interpretations in intercultural encounters. That was a DIEO photograph and journals, and to deal with culture shock. Okay, so that was the beginning of the presentations, when we get the students to suggest lessons they've already learned on this program that could help them with the simulated culture shock role play. Okay, so that is session 6, final one.